Okay, I think we are live. Let me get the YouTube stream set up here and we will get going. It's just taking a second here. I always have to load the stream and then mute it so there's not some extra feedback because then that can mess up the audio and stuff. So, all right. Hey, everyone. My Gavanen, and welcome to the live stream discussion for The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's part of our Lord of the Readathon. This is the second book we have read so far. And to be honest, I haven't even finished this book yet. I am very, very close to being done. I am just right near the end, if I can find the page that I stopped at here. I've got about this much, that much to go. So definitely not finished with it yet. I tried as much as I could to read the book as fast as I could while still being able to enjoy it, but get it done before this live stream. And turns out couldn't quite do that. I just got a little too busy and I just didn't end up finishing it in time. But you know what? That's okay. We've still got some time, and I'll just finish this probably by tomorrow, hopefully, and then start book 2, The Two Towers. But I feel like since I've read the majority of the book, I can discuss a lot about what I've already read and probably enough to do a live stream on it anyways. And I mean, I know the story. I'm pretty familiar with the story. So I can probably talk about at least all the chapters I've gotten to, and then maybe just some thoughts I have about the ending, having not finished the book. I know it's a little cheesy, but I'm doing my best here. So if you are live in the chat, you can send a message and talk about where your reading progress is at. If you've enjoyed reading it so far, how your experience has been, or like just where you're at in the readathon. Because I know a couple people, some of y'all have told me that you're still reading The Hobbit, which is okay. No rush at all. I think a big part of this readathon is just enjoying it and taking your time with it. There's no need to rush. Everyone can go at their own pace. I'm following a timeline and a schedule because I want to try and do these live streams. So it's a little pressure for me, but as far as just reading the books, like this is Tolkien. Like let's take some time to really enjoy the books and the stories. That's one of the gripes I have about readathons is a lot of times I feel like I'm cramming. I'm trying to read a lot of books really, really fast to, win the readathon and complete it. And sometimes you just don't comprehend the story, or it just goes in one ear and out the other, and you just don't really remember it afterwards. So that's kind of what I'm trying to avoid with doing this readathon, is really taking the time to enjoy and comprehend and absorb the stories, because this really is a masterful work of art. So anyways, no worries about it, if you hadn't finished it yet or where your progress is at, it's fine. And you're welcome to, if you're watching this on playback, to leave a comment and answer any of the discussion points that we talk about in the stream. No big deal at all. I'll still try to get to your comments. So anyways, so we'll go ahead and get started. So The Fellowship of the Ring, The Lord of the Rings itself, this is a sequel to The Hobbit. A lot of people, I think, confuse The Hobbit as being maybe a prequel to Lord of the Rings, and that's largely because the movies came out second, and that's when prequels started becoming a thing, started becoming popular. You had like The Hobbits, you had, even Star Wars to a degree, and then you had these like spin-off TV shows, just like the era of making prequels from something else kind of really took off. And that's why I think The Hobbit played into that a little bit as far as the movies go. But for the books, The Lord of the Rings is very much a sequel to The Hobbit, and that's very apparent in the story. And that's one of the things I really love about The Fellowship of the Ring, especially, is how many callbacks there are to The Hobbit. Like, there's a lot of just like elements of the story, things that happen, people who appear again from The Hobbit, and it just makes it great. And there's a lot of things that are referenced. Bilbo is in this book for a little bit, and he talks about his adventures. And at one point, I think Frodo even meets one of the dwarves that was with Bilbo and Thorin on their adventure. So like, it's cool to see some of these characters return and to see a lot of the events of The Hobbit referenced and mentioned, and it really helps build the backstory and set the stage for Frodo as the new protagonist and his adventure, and just really kind of establishing a timeline of like where everyone's at, where the Shire's at now. It's this many years, 60 years have passed, and the events of The Hobbit have changed the lives of all the Baggins. So I think that's one of the things I really like about it is definitely how apparent it is that this is a sequel to to The Hobbit, and just how that story so seamlessly ties into Lord of the Rings and particularly in the Fellowship. Because originally, The Hobbit was published in 1937, and it was a standalone, whimsical children's fantasy novel. And as Tolkien had begun writing The Fellowship of the Ring and the Lord of the Rings saga as a whole, he went back and kind of retconned The Hobbit a little bit just to make it tie into the Lord of the Rings. So by no means is it like no longer canon and changed or anything. I mean, the story remains largely the same with just a lot of editorial changes, but he definitely tweaked some things to make it fit with Lord of the Rings. There really wasn't much he had to do, honestly, because the story itself is like the perfect like not sequel, prologue or stage setter for the entire main arc of the story. So it's not like he had to do too much, but yeah, that started out as something else, and then it got kind of woven in, grandfathered into the Lord of the Rings. And I just really like how well Tolkien blended those stories together and made it fit so seamlessly. So I thought that was really cool. Before we go any further, I'm going to say this might be a little bit of a shorter stream tonight. Last week we went like an hour and a half, and that was really fun. I enjoyed that a lot. But this week, a little bit of a time crunch because I have to go somewhere after the stream. So I'm going to try and keep this short and try not to go over maybe an hour at least. So I'm just saying that before we get into everything. So a few points that I wanted to talk about, just starting with the Fellowship and with Lord of the Rings, is there's a letter at the very beginning. I'm going to see if it's in this edition. It was in one of the other editions. I have two that I'm reading. I have this small paperback, and then I have a hardcover illustrated edition that I had been reading. This one is just really good for being portable. So like if I want to go somewhere or sit somewhere else around the house, I can always bring this with me. The hardcover book is a little bit bulkier, and it's a very nice illustrated kind of collectible edition. So it's one that I don't really want to bring out of my library because it's precious to me. So I want to keep those in kind of nice condition. So this one helps to really be able to just pick it up and go. So I've been kind of reading out of both copies, and these are also vintage copies. These are like out of print now. These were published in the early 90s or late 90s or somewhere in there, and they're UK paperbacks too, so they're a little hard to find. I had to track these down on eBay and get them shipped to me. And I'm really glad I have them, as if I needed another copy of this series. I've already got a lot of copies up there, but either way, I love these books and I love the story, and these little books just have a lot of heart to them. Like they're books that are meant to be like loved and read, and they already have creases and cracks in the spine from previous readers and owners. So they're meant to be read, and I wanted to read these, even though I do like my fancy illustrated editions. So I'm trying to see if it's in this edition. I think it is. It's like either it's like I forgot what it's called, a note on the text, or it's a forward. I think it's the forward. But basically it's a letter, and I found this letter to be very important. Yeah, it's the forward to the second edition is what it's called. But it's a letter that was written by Tolkien, talking about sort of the history of publishing Lord of the Rings, how he was working on it. And he goes into a lot of detail that I find very fascinating, but also important, especially given a lot of modern opinions that I've seen around Tolkien and some of his works. Is number one, this work had been like he'd been working on this project for a long time, basically since The Hobbit. So this is not something that like came to fruition years later after he'd published it. Like he was really working on this saga. I feel like very consecutively or just back to back. I don't know the right word. I'm not a dictionary here. He just was working on the books very close together, and he makes that clear that like this had been in the works a long time. He had been working on this a long time, and some very important things that he put in his letter here is one about how Lord of the Rings is fantasy. It is not meant to be inspired by real world events that were occurring during his time, like the World Wars and stuff like that. He does have a lot of important messages and themes in his stories, like obviously protecting the environment. He definitely did not like seeing the mass industrialization destroying the beautiful countryside of England. And sure, there's obviously like some life inspirations in there, things that were similar, familiar, or similar to him from his upbringing that he kind of inspires some of the settings and scenarios on. But he made it very clear that like this is his original fantasy work, and he wasn't trying to send a message regarding any sort of contemporary event happening at the time that he was writing. And he also uh, expressed, and this is something that I see quoted a lot, it's a very famous quote from Tolkien, that he detests allegory. He says he cordially dislikes allegory, and that interpretation is really left up to the reader. And I think that quote is so, so important because there's a lot of people out there, some innocent and some maybe to serve whatever narrative they want to have for something, whether it's like the Amazon Prime show or, a historian or whatever it may be. Just there are people out there who want to sort of project their own meaning to what Tolkien was intending to do, like projecting their own views of what his intentions were. There are people out there that claim that he was writing this as some sort of Catholic epic. This is this love letter to Catholicism, and that's simply not true. Even though he was Catholic, and obviously those were important views and maybe values that influenced his life and his worldview, he makes it very clear that like this is not Narnia and C.S. Lewis making some allegory to the gospel of Christianity or anything like that. Like he's writing this to be a fantasy and a fiction inspired by a lot of the old sagas and the old languages of Europe and the mythologies of Europe. And that is hugely important because that's what's written on the page, not just what he might have said in a letter or a press quote or something. Like that's what he wrote was this epic fantasy inspired by some of the lost mythology of England, some of the English poetry that had survived in fragments, and some other things too. Like he draws a lot from Norse and Germanic mythology as well as Finland and Finnish mythology. So, anyways, I just think that was really great. Like I'm glad that letter is in there just to make a really good point that like, hey, this is a neutral fantasy for everyone to enjoy, and it's not meant to send some sort of major political or moral message or anything like that. Like it's a fun fantasy novel that's inspired by a lot of cultural traditions and elements from England and English mythology, and expressing how he wanted to have an English mythology, obviously fantasy story, but like something that is inspired by the mythologies of England. And I feel like some people also miss that point as well. A lot of people look at it as like, well, hey, it's fantasy world. Anything goes. It can be whatever it wants. It's not real. But like, it is kind of drawn from a lot of cultural sources. So it's not just some fantasy like maybe Game of Thrones. It's legit like cultural in the way it goes with England and England's history. So I just thought that was a really great prologue to the story. Like before you read anything, he kind of prefaces that like, hey, this is just a pure fantasy and it's meant to be enjoyed. And he writes a lot in some of his other books, like on fairy stories and some of his other essays, like The Monsters and the Critics, a lot about some of these things and defending some of his writing choices and his views from critics of his own time that were criticizing a lot of things that he was writing. So all in all, I just thought that was great. It was a great way to preface and frame like going into the story. So I really, really appreciated that. And I feel like that really helps his story be timeless by letting his thoughts be known about it before anybody, gets their hands on it and tries to make their own rendition or their own interpretation of something and claim like, oh, this is what Tolkien thought, or this is how he viewed it. Cause it's like, well, what's written on the page of his actual book. Right. So anyways, I'm not trying to get into any like deep context or politics or anything like that. I just thought that was a really good, preface to Lord of the Rings. Now, going on kind of more into the story, I really like how chapter 1 of the book is called The Long Expected Party, and how that is like meant to be a reference to chapter 1 of The Hobbit, which was the unexpected party. So just right out the gate, like it just goes straight into the story right from The Hobbit. And I'm going to kind of be jumping around a little bit here, but later on in chapter, in one of the chapters, let me find which one it was, chapter 1 of book 2, basically. I think it's chapter 12 of the whole story, but chapter 1 is called Many Meetings. And at that point, Frodo and Bilbo are briefly reunited. And Bilbo says something, I forgot, I'm paraphrasing it because I can't remember the exact quote, but he says, like, do adventures ever really end? Someone's always, next to carry on the story. And I feel like that's a really great kind of meta message for the Lord of the Rings, because Frodo is now the new protagonist. It's sort of, the adventure has been transferred to him now. So Bilbo is in the story, but he's not the main character now. And I just thought that was great, and I thought it's a really nice way to like pass the torch on to Frodo. He's the new young hero, kind of young maybe for a Hobbit. So I really liked that, and I do like Frodo. I don't think I like him as much as Bilbo, but I really do like Frodo and his friends. Sam and Merry and Pippin, like they're iconic. They're the best. Sam's like the greatest friend anyone could ever ask for. I love him. He's so awesome. But I really did like that. And I think there's a big contrast in the difference between Bilbo and Frodo. Like Bilbo, as I said in my live stream last week, is, he's kind of a whimsical hero. The Hobbit is very whimsical fantasy, but he's very cheerful. He's very positive. Even in times where he's miserable, he still tries to like just see the best in everything, tries to work out the solution and figure out the problem. And he just maintains a very positive mindset, a very positive attitude. Meanwhile, Frodo seems to be a lot more of a kind of tragic hero. He's very sad and depressed. But I think the contrast here is Frodo kind of representing like growth and maturity and sort of a loss of innocence a little bit, and a loss of like the blissful ignorance. I found that in like chapter 2 when Gandalf is telling him the history of the ring and how the ring was passed down, basically coming to Frodo. And you can just see Frodo's like reality kind of start crumbling a little bit. All he knows is the happy and peaceful Shire, and all of a sudden he's getting all of this kind of information and history about the world going on outside of the Shire, and realizing that things are really not great. And you can just sort of feel like that crushing sadness and depression on him as he suddenly realizes the burden that he has. And yeah, I feel like that's somewhat metaphorical. Not that Tolkien meant it to be metaphorical necessarily or not, but just I saw it that way. Metaphorical of like growing up a little bit, and especially in this time, and especially our generation of people growing up and realizing, man, things kind of suck sometimes in the real world. And it's like, can't we just go back to being happy as kids or teenagers? So I found like that was kind of interesting. At least that was my own sort of thoughts I saw in that with Frodo passing the torch on to become the new protagonist. But I just love how all the characters feel so consistent. Bilbo feels consistent. Gandalf comes back and he just feels like the same good old Gandalf the Grey. It's really, really nice. And I just like how the whole thing sort of unfolds from there. And we spend a lot more time in the Shire in this book. Half this book is basically the Shire and exiting the Shire. So it's kind of nice to see more of it. But I feel like The Hobbit just gave you just good enough of a dose of it. Like you got the idea that that's Bilbo's home. That's where he lives. It's his natural habitat. And outside of that is the adventure. Whereas here, The Hobbit the Shire feels so much bigger. There's even a map that's included in the beginning of the book. I'll get to some of this in a second because I have some things to say about the map and geography of Middle Earth. But either way, like there's a map in the beginning of the book right here. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's the map of the Shire. And so the Shire like now feels bigger. The whole world of Middle Earth starts feeling bigger in this story. It starts feeling in a grander scale of things, and it feels like you really see how far apart certain places are because of how long it takes to get there. And you didn't have that sense necessarily in The Hobbit. Like you did feel like things were really, really far, going all the way from the Shire to the Lonely Mountain was like across the world. But like you don't get a full map of Middle Earth. You just get the map of like the Misty Mountains and the Lonely Mountain. So you don't quite know like the exact distance from everything. But with Lord of the Rings, you get a full map of Middle Earth and of the Shire. So you really see just how big this world is and the scope of everything. Um, so I thought that was interesting. I'm jumping around a lot because I was talking about geography, but I want to go back to talking about another kind of reference or theme I saw. Was when Bilbo describes like the ring kind of stretching him thin, the wearer being stretched thin or fading. Gandalf talks about like if someone has the ring for too long, they'll start to fade. And the ring being able to preserve like long life, Bilbo being able to live over 100 years old, Gollum being able to live like 500 years, and just how the ring like preserves long life like that, but still makes the wearer thin and fade out. Kind of reminded me like of the picture of Dorian Gray, sort of like that's kind of how it feels in that story where he stays youthful, but it's an unnatural, kind of almost sinister youthfulness, while his portrait is what ages. It's kind of like that deal with the devil sort of thing where he gets this eternal youth, but there's a lot of downsides at the same time. So I feel like that kind of reminded me of that with the ring a little bit. Um, so yeah, I thought that was cool. And the prologue, I forgot to even talk about like the prologue of this book. I like how it goes into a lot more history of the Shire. I love like the first point of the prologue is concerning hobbits, which is like one of the most iconic musical themes from the movies. But it goes into a lot of the history of the Shire and the migration of the hobbits, and it talks about the different breeds of hobbits. So there are Stores, Harfoots, and Fallowhides. Three different breeds of hobbits. The Harfoots are not ancestors to the hobbits like the Amazon show is trying to portray them as. Like they are just one subsection of hobbits. And so don't really know what they were doing with that. I think it's because they don't have the right to the word hobbit, so they can't use it. But I just thought that was a little silly. But there's three different types of hobbits, and it explains how each of them like slowly migrated across the world, eventually ending up in the Shire, and how some of them I think stayed behind or went further south. And I think those hobbits, or at least like half hobbits, slowly became the people that Gollum or Smeagol was originally part of, because I think he was like related to the hobbits in some way. So that was kind of cool to see some of that history going on and explaining about the history of the kingdoms out of the west that used to be there that have long since passed from like the first age and second age. So that was really cool, and just like the origin of the Hobbit and the way the Shire keeps time and has their own calendar and a lot of that stuff, which is based on Anglo-Saxon timekeeping. So I thought that was cool, and just a lot of that, and how it goes into detail like the record keeping, like how some of these records are scattered about. Frodo wrote one account, Merry and Pippin worked on some other accounts, and then like you had the scribes of the great kingdoms like Gondor that were working on some historical accounts as well. And so it's like all of this separate information and somewhat comparative information that's being recorded at the same time, and whoever the narrator is trying to like compile it together to make this full story, which they refer to as like the Red Book of Westmarch. And there's this whole meta thing that you can get into of like, is Lord of the Rings really the story, or is that like someone's view of the story about historical events that happened in Middle Earth? Like it's almost like someone's embellishing a historical event into the story of the Lord of the Rings. Kind of weird and meta, but it's cool. And I just thought it was interesting because like that is somewhat how history can be recorded sometimes. It can be very, very scattered and fractured. And it's not always reliable, and sometimes it is, but it's just like, well, one source says this and another source says that, and it's kind of maybe the answer somewhere in between both of those or something like that. Like it's interesting how Tolkien really understood that, because obviously as a professor and as a linguist, a philologist, and someone who studied mythology, he was probably well aware of just like how fractured records can be. So I thought that was very interesting to kind of incorporate a little bit of that into the prologue there. Um, So yeah, I really liked that. I liked a lot of the setup going into the story. Uh, some of the things I did not like, I feel like I need to talk about this just because, it's hard to criticize a book like Lord of the Rings because it's J.R.R. Tolkien's masterpiece and he's such a good writer. So it is very difficult to criticize things. And I have kind of been going by the rule that, like, these are things that I don't like, but not necessarily flaws in the book because I don't think Tolkien really left room for a lot of error in his stories. Obviously, no artist is going to think that their work is perfect, but I don't think he really left a lot of margin for error. And so I think these are mostly just things that I didn't enjoy as much as maybe he enjoyed writing. And one of the things are the first few chapters of the Fellowship. So chapters 3 through 8, basically, which makes up a good chunk of this book. It makes up almost half the book, really. Let me see if I can show you. That's how much chapters 3 through 8 is, or the beginning to chapter 8 is. It's about that much. So it's almost half of the book. Um, they are slogs. They are just so slow, and it is really hard to get through them. Mostly it's because it is Frodo's departure of the Shire. Once he realizes that he has to take the ring and leave, and he can't stay in the Shire because it's dangerous. And his friends eventually kind of work it all out, and they plan to go together. Uh, I did like how it was methodical the way Frodo left. He didn't just up and run away like in the movie. He like moves to another part of the Shire and then has everyone kind of convinced that he's moved back to this place and sells his old property, sells Bag End to the Sackville Bagginses, which sucks because Bag End's like the luxury hobbit hole. And so he leaves Hobbiton and he goes way out to Buckland and moves out there. And then from there, he like slowly just quietly in the night makes his way across the Shire and through the hedge and on the road and into the forest and all of that. So I like the methodic kind of plan to move out of the Shire, whereas in the movie he's just running. But the chapters are so slow, and so much of it is them just walking and wandering around and encountering things here and there, and it drags on a little bit. I do like some moments in it. There's a moment where he meets some of the elves who are wandering in the woods just kind of right outside the Shire or wandering on the road that cuts a little bit into the Shire there. So he meets some elves. One of them is called Gildor, and they are related to Elrond and the elves of Rivendell. And I thought that was cool. And there's a reference to the Silmarillion. The elves say that they are from the house of Finrod or Fingolfin, one of those, who is related to Galadriel and some of the other elves, some of the high elves of the First Age, a lot of that. So there's some connections there to the Silmarillion, which I thought were cool. So that was a nice moment there. And then being pursued by the Nazgul, which they call the Black Riders. That was also interesting because they really are spooky. Like the film does a good job of portraying how dark and sinister they are, but when they're being portrayed in the book, they're mostly being viewed from the Hobbit's point of view, and the Hobbits don't know who they are or what they are. So it's very creepy because it's like this somewhat like eldritch type of thing. Like they don't know what this is, they just know it's bad and it's chasing them. So it's kind of spooky. So I did like that. But there's just a lot of traveling in this whole book, like not even in just those chapters, even later on. There's more traveling and stuff, and it sometimes doesn't quite serve the story. And I think that's why a movie is a lot better in terms of like depiction of things because they can do the show don't tell, whereas in a book you can't really show, so you have to tell the story. But in the movie you can have like a montage of them just walking across the country, and then a minute or two later they've reached their destination, whereas in the book it takes 8 chapters to get where they want to go. So that was definitely a thing that bothered me, and I think it's also why I'm still reading it and haven't finished it yet, is just because of how long it's taken to get through some of that. I feel like the pacing is very up and down in this book, where some things are happening really fast and then other things are just happening at a snail's pace and they're very, very slow. And I almost feel like that it was unnecessary. Like it didn't have to be that slow. I get it that it's like it's this master world building and character building and all the good stuff that makes this series what it is. But like there definitely felt like some unnecessary slowness in some of this. So that was a little bit frustrating. But the chapters aren't terrible. They're just slow. They're somewhat episodic, like The Hobbit was, where each peril they enter is sort of an adventure of itself. And so them traveling and running away from the Black Riders or evading the Black Riders and going into the old forest and getting attacked by some of the trees is like in its own adventure there. And then being pursued by the riders all the way to Rivendell is an adventure, and on and on and on it goes there. One chapter that I did really like though was Tom Bombadil. All the chapters involving him in Tom Bombadil's house is like chapter 7, I think. And his character on its own is one of my favorite characters. I love Tom Bombadil. That is a point where it does feel like the story really slows and almost comes to a halt. But I feel like it was somewhat similar to The Hobbit in like Beorn's cabin, where they come and they rest a while and they talk and they explore some stuff, their characters and their histories. So it is a little slow, but Tom Bombadil just is so lively that it's one of those great chapters. It's iconic, and it's disappointing that he wasn't in the movie, but it's understandable just due to pacing reasons why he couldn't be, because it is very long to get through a lot of this stuff. But he's one of my favorite side characters, and I just love the way that he knows the ways of the land. He knows how to live in the wild, and he knows the forest, and he's got a little bit of magic to him. And I just think it's great. And he's got this elven wife named Goldberry, and she's just like this beautiful maiden elf, long flowing blonde hair, and she has this amazing enchanting singing voice. It's very fairy tale esque. It's very like, you know, the Fair Maiden, but I really like how Tom and Goldberry are sort of these forest dwellers. It very much feels like this fairy tale animistic like forest dwelling folk. They're living there in the wild, and yeah, it's fun. And Goldberry, definitely like a bookish crush for me. I think her character is just beautiful, and she and Tom just go so well together as a pair, hosting the hobbits and being good hosts and helping them on their way. And she and Tom Bombadil both kind of aid them as they're leaving and are kind of struggling to get back on their way. They both come and help them. So I think that was great. I really like Goldberry. She's pretty great. And it's also fun because you don't really know like where Tom Bombadil comes from, or why Tom Bombadil exists, or what his magic is, or how old he is. Like, he's this character that just is so unknown. But like, he gives you little hints, he gives you little ideas, because he quotes a lot of histories that he claims to have been a part of, or claims to have been around when they were happening. Now, again, it could be like an unreliable narrator. Maybe he's claiming he knows those things. I don't know. But like, it's fun that you don't really know a lot about him, but he's such a lively, standout side character. And Tolkien did write more about him in one of his short stories called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and it's found in his collection of Tales from the Perilous Realm, which I do have up on my shelf right up there. So they are available to read if anyone wanted to read them and get more of that character, if they really liked that character. But it's just one of my favorite chapters. I just feel like it's an iconic chapter. There's a lot of these early chapters in the Fellowship. I mean, the whole book, but a lot of the early chapters that are iconic, like Frodo finding the ring, that chapter 2, Tom Bombadil's chapter, and just some other ones later in the story that I haven't quite gotten to yet, but I know are pretty popular. Like, there's some iconic stuff in this book. So I just really enjoyed that. And the chapter is also kind of important because that's the first time that Frodo puts on the ring. So like chapter 7, when they're at Tom Bombadil's house, is the first time he uses the ring. Even though Gandalf's advised him all this time not to use it, that's the first time he does. And it's kind of like, that's the start of Frodo's slow corruption. Not that he's necessarily turning to evil, but like the ring kind of grasping a hold on him finally, willing him to put the ring on all this time until he finally gives into it and puts the ring on. So that's kind of significant for that. But after this chapter, the book kind of picks up the pace again, and that's really refreshing after a lot of slow chapters through the forest. It starts picking up again. And the next chapter, chapter 8, is called The Barrow Downs, and that one was also pretty spooky because it's dealing with like some kind of ghostly type of creatures, the Barrow Wights, that are living in these like old burial sites, these old mounds, basically, where like old kings and warriors had been buried from wars in ancient ages past that took place in that area where they are. And so I think that was definitely like a spooky, because they're very phantom-like, they're very ghostly-like, and they're sinister. And I think they might be similar to like the ghastly spirits of the oath breakers that Aragorn recruits in Return of the King to be like his army to help the battle at Pelennor. So I think that they could be related, kind of in just like the type of creature they are, but I don't really know. And this might be again somewhat connected to like Norse and Celtic mythology. I'm not totally sure. Like, there's no source that says Tolkien drew from this, but in those mythologies of like Norse, especially, um, like Norse folklore, there was a type of being called a Draugr, and they were kind of like this undead spirit type of figure. I don't really know a good way to explain it. You'll just have to look it up and get it from an expert folklorist who knows more than I do about it. But like they are kind of like a guardian of these burial mounds, and they're very spooky and ghoulish, I guess you could say. Not quite like a zombie, but not a ghost either. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Um, but anyways, I feel like maybe that was connected into like the burial mounds and stuff like that. But either way, it was definitely very spooky, and it's a very good chapter. And it's the first time that Frodo like finds a little bit of courage in him. Like all this time, he's been kind of on the run. He's been scared of these Black Riders stalking him. He's been afraid of like the forest kind of creeping on him. And this is like the first time where he really is kind of in a desperate situation and like draws that kernel of Tookish courage in him to well, I guess at this point, Baggins' courage to help his friends and to escape that situation. And Tom Bombadil briefly comes back and helps him a little bit too. So the story really picks up from there, and then like at that point, it really kind of follows the way the movie goes. Like the first part of exiting the Shire and getting all the way to Tom Bombadil was a huge chunk of the book that got cut from the movie. And understandably so, just because of pacing issues. Like, holy cow, that would have made the movie an extra hour long, and it's already long. So I understand why they had to remove all that, but it is sad to kind of miss some of those special scenes. Um, but from there, it pretty much follows beat for beat the way the movie goes, which I think more people have seen the movie than the book. But like they go to Bree, they meet Aragorn, who's known as Strider, the Ranger, and the Nazgul kind of attack them again, and they have to flee. They go to Weathertop, and and all of that. So it kind of follows from there, like pretty well. Follows the book there. So let me just think. What else was I going to say? I really liked how Tolkien makes a lot of references to the Hobbit in the first part of their journey. Well, a lot of the parts of their journey, but especially the first part with like the old forest. It kind of feels like it was paralleling Mirkwood a little bit. Like when they're in Mirkwood, it's this sort of dark, enchanted forest that they can't quite find their way through, and things are kind of alive in there and not very friendly. And it seemed like that was similar to Mirkwood. And when they go to the mines of Moria later on, when they go to the Misty Mountains, they go through Moria. It does kind of feel like that parallels a bit of like the Goblin tunnels under the Misty Mountains, where Bilbo finds Gollum in the ring and all of that. So I found that was kind of funny, and just like a lot of moments like that. Obviously, the path they take kind of out east is similar to like they go to Rivendell, then they go to the mines, and then they're on the other side of the mountains, and they're going further east, and it kind of is a similar path. They encounter the elves along the way in Lorien, and just thinking about how the journeys are parallel, but also like they literally go through some of these callbacks, like as they're wandering through the wildlands of the West on their way to Rivendell, they come across the big trolls that got turned to stone from chapter 2 of The Hobbit. And they talk about how, oh, this is where Bilbo camped, and this is like where the troll cave was with the treasure, and like just little callbacks like that. I just love it. It's just fun to see how all that fits in. I know I'm kind of repeating myself with it, but it's really fun to see how all of that fit in with the rest of the story. Yeah, you can see how much like Bilbo really influenced Frodo. Another thing that I thought was fun was like, so the Nazgul is what they're called, the Black Riders. They're the 9 Nazgul that are controlled by Sauron. I think they were originally the 9 kings, like in the Ring poem, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die. Like those were the 9 men, the 9 kings that had the rings of power. So the Nazgul, like being referred to as the hobbits, as these black riders, these mysterious riders, is pretty like spooky and chilling, which I think is kind of fun for this time of year with like the spooky season kind of coming up. But But like I was also feeling a little creeped out reading about them, because there's a moment in chapter 9 or 10, where they are approaching Frodo's abandoned house at Crick Hollow, where they think he's moved to. Um, and as they approach, like just the way Tolkien set that scene up and described the scene is really actually kind of chilling. It was really spooky. And it kind of had like almost like a Poe, Edgar Allan Poe feel to it. It was just spooky, like how it was all set up. And I really liked that. Um, the way the scene goes is the Nazguls attack Frodo's home, but the entire Brandybuck clan of hobbits that are living in that area kind of like rise the village, like they arouse the village, and they all blow horns to like scare the Nazgul off. And I really liked that. They were like the ancient Buckland horns that hadn't been blown in 100 years. But I just thought that was awesome. I was like, way to go, hobbits, defending your territory, getting like defending the Shire. It was so awesome because it really shows like the spirit of the hobbits. Like they can come together. They have a survival instinct. It doesn't always seem like they do because they're all like fat and happy and love to eat, but they have a survival instinct. And it shows how they can come together and defend their Shire when necessary. And in that chapter, I think it's chapter 11, The Knife in the Dark, it also kind of talks about some history of the Shire. There was a time when these white wolves prowled about hunting in the Shire hundreds of years ago during what they called the Fell Winter. And that really made me think of Game of Thrones and like the Song of Ice and Fire. And I think that's probably where George R. R. Martin might have drawn some inspiration to come up with like the Long Night and the White Walkers and stuff like that. Maybe it just seemed very similar in idea. And it's kind of like this lore, this history that happened 100 years ago, you know. So I think that's interesting. And honestly, to be real, we wouldn't have Game of Thrones if it weren't for Lord of the Rings. So yeah, I just thought that was pretty fun. But yeah, I guess another flaw I should mention, because this is something I meant to talk about earlier, was the geography. I found like the geography in this book to be confusing as hell. Holy cow, I could not keep up with the geography and like visualizing these landscapes. You know, you have the movies you can go off of as like a visual reference, but obviously that's someone's interpretation. But like trying to understand some of like where these places are and what they look like can be very difficult because for one, I found the Shire geography to be absolutely all over the place and confusing because there's a map in here that explains what the Shire looks like, and it's divided into 4 farthings: the north, the east, south, and west. And East Farthing is like where they're going to exit the Shire. But as they're in the East Farthing, Tolkien keeps describing everything as westward. So it's like they're taking the road in East Farthing, but they're on the western side, or they're passing to the western side of this location or this village, but that village is pretty far east on the East Farthing. That's like to pass west of that is like almost going way out of the way of where they're trying to go, more so than what would be reasonable just to get around like parts of the road that they're worried about are being watched. It's like they're going back into the Shire, I think back. It just kind of zigzags, and I felt like that was really hard to follow. And same with like the Old Forest, the Wildlands, pretty much anywhere that they were traveling. And like I said, there's so much traveling in this book; it's getting a little ridiculous. Like there's only so many forests and mountains you can describe, and at some point it just gets really hard to picture because I felt like there were so many places they went that were hilly, like they weren't mountainous like the Misty Mountains. They were just very like foothills and big hills and stuff like that. But it's like everywhere they went was hills. So it's like, what does this place look like? Like, are they hills that are covered in trees, or the hills that are covered in grass? You know, he describes them pretty well, but it just felt like it was really hard to visualize stuff. And like his directions kept going back and forth. So like he'd say they're on the path headed east, but after so many miles, they reach the northern end of this. And it's like you look on the map of Middle Earth and you see the road not going north, it's going east. One point they said, here the Great East Road takes a bend to the north. And so they were trying to shortcut around it. And I look on the map and the road's not going north at all. It's just going in a straight line. Stuff like that just really got to me because I'm trying to visualize Middle Earth and like what I'm seeing here. And I'm like not really getting a good picture of it. And the illustrated edition of The Hobbit and of Fellowship does help because it gives you like an artist's rendition of what that scene might look like. But it got to be kind of frustrating after a while to really like follow what this looks like, which direction they're going. This constant zigzagging of like saying they're going east, but then talking about the westward orientation of everything. He really goes. I mean, this just shows how detailed he is. Honestly, that he talks about direction and orientation. I find that very interesting, but it just got to be really, really hard to follow. So that was one thing that bothered me, I guess, was just like the geography being confusing, and then the pacing just going up and down so much. Some of the other things that bothered me was like how the pacing was affected by certain portions where the hobbits were just singing. And I get it, like that is a trademark of Tolkien's writing is song, and it's a big part of culture, both like English culture, but also like in the hobbits and in the Middle Earth, like the hobbits, the elves, dwarves, every like group of people in Middle Earth has like their own little folksy song culture. Um, and I loved like the Tolkien singing and songs and stuff. Like it's great, but some songs serve kind of a purpose of recalling old ages past and talking about the histories and the battles and the songs of old that give a lot of like world building and detail and history to the whole thing. Excuse me one second here. Sorry about that, guys. I got a little interrupted there. I'm getting short on my time and I've got somewhere to be. So I might have to cut this live stream a little short. So this is going to be a part one. And I will get back to everyone for like a part two, maybe tomorrow. But as I was saying, was like some of these Tolkien's like folk songs were very much like going into the history of Middle Earth, and then there were other songs that were kind of absurd and like whimsical and just didn't really add to the story much, and it felt like it delayed the story. It felt like it was a pause to read, 2.5 pages of some big long verse of song that Samwise comes up with that just don't add anything other than just singing about what's happening. And then you get back to the story, and it's kind of something you want to skip. You're like, can we just get back to like what's happening in the plot, please? Like, it's not adding to like the history and context. Because there's one song about Beren and Luthien, which is also a story from the Silmarillion that is directly related to Aragorn. So it makes sense that Aragorn is telling the hobbits about this and sharing that with him, with them, and singing the song for them. But then there's songs like I said, with Samwise or Pippin or whomever, and they're just singing random stuff, and it doesn't add to the story much. I just felt like that was kind of frustrating because it kind of puts pause on everything, and it just slows the pacing to a halt, and then you have to pick it back up later. So I just felt like that was a little hard to get through. But I'm almost done. I've got, like I said, like maybe a third of the book left to finish, and then I should be done with it hopefully by tomorrow or so, maybe the next day. And yeah, then we can move on and go on to the next one. So I hope everyone's having a great experience so far reading and enjoying the books. And I'd love to know all of your thoughts and comments. Unfortunately, I have to go, so I'm going to cut this live stream short. But yeah, please leave a comment. Tell me how your reading experience is going, and I will try to get to all of your chats pretty soon. I might have to answer these in the next live stream. But thanks everyone, though. I appreciate you guys tuning in and watching this back afterwards on playback. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, if you felt the same as I have, if you felt like that was what you thought when you were reading it too, if you had the same ideas, or if you like something maybe that I didn't catch or that I didn't like as much. Like I'd love to know all your thoughts. So let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get back to them. And I will plan the next live stream to be real soon, just kind of catch up and talk about the next half of the book as like a part two, and then we'll just go from there. So anyways, thanks everyone so much for watching and tuning in. Really appreciate everyone, and happy reading and good luck. So I'll see you guys real soon with a new video. Bye, everyone.